So as we kind of jump into this, so objectives, right? We're here to talk to you guys and we want to help you. And I'm going to start at the bottom, for the first one is we want to answer your questions, right? So, as Jeff has mentioned, as Jerry mentioned, please interrupt us, ask questions at any time. You can put them in the chat and, whether it's Betsy or it's Jeff, they can interrupt and ask us the question. We want those questions to be timely. We want to be able to be interactive, right? We're here to serve you and make sure that we're answering those questions. So please do not hesitate. I've got water here that I can take a drink of while we listen to your question and really make sure we're answering, what is on your mind. There are no bad questions as I'm sure you guys have heard before, and we certainly reiterate that. So we want to familiarize you with the terminology and the techniques, right? Assessment, risk, vulnerability, exploitation, incident, event, best practice, awareness, compliance, all these different words you're going to hear. Seeing a lot of the titles, a lot of that will resonate with you. Some of it may not, right? And hopefully we're putting a lot of those things in perspective. As we look at techniques, when you look at security, it's not out of a box, right? It's custom. It's custom for each and every organization. We're talking to a lot of different organizations right now. So what works for one organization may not work for yours. So we're going to kind of go through a lot of those different techniques. We're going to address the principles of having a security strategy, right? So how to implement, where to start, who needs to be involved, right? We've got a lot of different titles on this call. And when we look at these strategies, it's a top-down approach. It's the entire organization that has to be involved in building the security strategy. We want to help you cultivate, a culture of security, right? Culture is a huge part of what you want to do when it comes to security, right? The collective attitudes and actions inside an organization, right? Do they embrace security, understand its importance, right? I use the term protecting the organization, right? Can we do that? We're looking at continuous improvement, right? We're never done, right? There's always something to look at next. And it's frustrating maybe, right? Is we're never done. We're always going on to the next thing. But that's what kind of keeps it interesting and fun, right? The bad guys, right? Those bad actors that we're trying to protect the organization from, they're never done, right? And generally we're behind them. So we got to work even harder to try to stay ahead of them. Our goal is to reduce risk and build trust, right? We're never going to get rid of risk. Risk is always going to exist in some form or fashion, right? But we got to bring it down to a manageable level. We got to make sure we present that risk, right? If we identify a risk at any level of the organization, make sure it makes its way up to the top, right? That's our key. That's our goal. That's that communication. And by doing that, we're going to build trust, right? Building trust within the organization, outside the organization, right? The faculty, the administrators, the family, the community, right? Everything that makes up your school. And then again, reiterate, we're here to answer your questions. So if you have any at any time, feel free to interrupt us and we're happy to discuss.
Great. Yeah, one note, CJ, on that, I'd like to jump in real quickly on look at reducing risk and there is such a thing as being too risk adverse. That is to say, if you don't take any risk in getting out the door with respect to implementing, whether it's a new delivery channel or something on campus that could improve, services to the student or faculty and things like that. So you want to establish a risk appetite. I'll touch on that a little bit later as we go into the framework aspects and a few other things about assessments. But risk appetite is fundamental, a very, very important feature or facet of this whole thing. So the outline, that's me. The outline, this dovetails nicely into, the objectives that CJ mentioned. We have, only about a little bit less than an hour here to kind of cover a lot of things. So, with respect to the framework, we want to start with that, but really digging into that a little bit and identifying what framework is appropriate for you. And you'll realize there's no real silver bullet, right? Regardless of industry. I came from the financial industry. I've worked in a lot of different verticals. As I mentioned earlier, I am a qualified security assessor. We've seen and audited firms with different frameworks. At the end of the day, don't lose sight of the goal of implementing a framework that works for your institution. It may not be perfect. There's no perfect one. So there's a lot of techniques we'll talk about as we work our way through these following slides to kind of give you some tips as to how to best pick the best one for you and then how to move to sort of implement that with your organization.
Right. And understand too, when we're talking about a framework, right, that's part of your design. That's an outline. There's many frameworks, as Jerry mentioned. Which one's best for you? And as you go through these frameworks, there's hundreds of controls, there's hundreds of recommendations, right? Not every single one is, as we talked about, these aren't out of a box. So as we go through, we start assessing what do you have, what don't you have, what can we do, what maybe can't we do, what do we have restrictions on from a financial standpoint. So again, these frameworks are out there. A lot of these are a guideline to kind of get you to where you need to be.
Thanks, CJ. And moving along, assessment, right? It is a familiar term. You think about assessments, it's everything from when I hear assessment, I think from self-assessing, meaning within my institution, within my whether it's a college or university, or honestly whatever the business is. What am I assessing? I'm looking at the different controls and assessing to ensure that these controls, as designed, operate effectively to reduce risk to reasonable levels. There's levels of assessment, like I mentioned. Some can be internal, like that, the self-assessment. There can be also an independent assessment, which is a little bit better in the sense that you've got that sort of outside independent set of eyes assessing, the same controls, but from a different perspective. And then you can kind of amp it up a little bit by talking about auditing versus risk assessing, which is a deeper dive. It involves deeper sampling and a lot more, certainly more cost, but also cost in terms of the burden it puts on the institution as well. So you want to kind of balance some of that. Some of those are required, and others are optional, but we'll talk through some of that as well, and certainly ping us with questions along the way, as we mentioned earlier. Next bullet, one of my favorite ones: people, process, and technology. This became pretty popular probably about 10 years ago now. I'm a little bit older than CJ, but okay, I'm a lot older than CJ.
You never know, Jerry.
The point is, way back when it was always technology, technology. And you guys still hear today, DR, disaster recovery. And it was like, that was what they focused on in many industries, where it was just the restoration of technology. And then they realized, and they being the powers in all verticals, that kind of was like, hey, let's take a step back. We do need the technology restoration, that's for sure. But we need people as well. We need the processes in place to move to not only, in the case of disaster recovery, now they call it business continuity or business continuity management, which is the holistic approach. And you're seeing that with all kinds of things. And CJ is an expert in when you talk about security officers and virtual, he's a virtual chief security officer for a lot of organizations, and people, process, technology is what he lives and breathes every day. So we get a lot out of that from him. The next one is a tough one, and this is probably one of the bigger challenges, and not even knowing the specific higher ed facilities or organizations that are on this call. Cultural shifts, it's tough in any vertical, right? People often, the tendency is not to change, and so NO becomes the quick knee-jerk reaction, versus taking a moment, take a step back, understand really what the concept is, and know, KO and W, know what we're talking about, versus just jump into a quick no. And again, CJ is going to touch on that a lot in more detail a little bit later on. Adaptability, my man from the service over here, adaptability is everything, right? So adapting to changing environments. I don't want to say we wish everything stayed the same, because if we did, I think all of our businesses, ours included, would be out of business in short, right? So change is good. Adapting to that change is even better. So I always think about when new solutions or technologies come out, everybody's excited, regardless of industry. We're all pumped up, like, let's get this into production. We can serve our students better, our faculty, and make life better. And they rush to the market, and you do it just a little bit sooner than you probably should. You should probably take a step back, risk assess it before you implement it, and then educate folks and roll it out properly. And boy, you can have the same results, in fact, better results, with less risks to your organization. So let's embrace change. Let's embrace the need to adapt to those changing environments. And even if your college or universities was quite stagnant, rest assured the world of threat is an ever-changing landscape. So you need to move and change accordingly and adapt to those changes.
Yeah, and just to kind of follow up to what Jerry said, and putting a couple of these pieces together, right? When you go through an assessment, right, and you guys are familiar with the term assessment, right? We're assessing all the time, especially in a learning environment, in a higher education environment. But we're assessing all the time. We're assessing each other. We're assessing our abilities. We're assessing our knowledge. We're assessing our students, right? Where do they sit at this moment? And a lot of times, an assessment is a point in time, assessment. At this point in time, this is where we sit. And we can turn that assessment into goals and projects and planning and getting to where we want to be. And sometimes that, go all the way back down to adaptability, right? Priorities change based on the environment, on the landscape. In cybersecurity, the bad actors and AI, right? What changes? What do we have to adapt to? And a large part of that assessment is going to be those people, processing, and technology, right? Hey, we have the people, but we have no process to get there, right? Maybe we have the technology, or we're lacking a little bit of technology. Or, hey, we've got process, we don't have people to help us manage this and get us through it, right? So we end up with a gap sometimes. Or we've got people in process, but we are just lacking on the technology to really help protect us. So again, there's such a true balance between those pieces. We've got a lot of experience of working with organizations in all verticals, right, that struggle with that balance. And again, it's continuously changing, right? So that's back to that adaptability. And then that cultural shift for me from no to no. And again, I will touch on this again, a little bit later, is 22 years in the military, managing cybersecurity in a very, highly regulated environment, right? I got to say no a lot, right? The answer was no, 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 can't do that. Nope, can't do that. Nope, sorry. Nope, sorry. Sometimes I wasn't sorry. Shifting over to the private sector now, how do we say yes? Right? How do we turn those no's into yeses? How do we allow you to become more functional and more operational in your environment, right? For your faculty, for your students, to be more nimble, but do it in the most secure fashion, right? So that's just kind of, following up on what Jerry had said, how in my mind I bring these five principles together.
So now when we get to the key of some of this, the starting point, really, right? We talk about frameworks. There are a couple here that we identified as some of really good ones that are utilized in higher ed. We audit and perform security services for a number of higher education facilities and organizations, whether it's a small college or a very large university. Selecting frameworks, that we highly recommend obviously doing so and implementing it, but there's a whole process to that. Starts with which one makes the most sense for my school, for my organization. It does come down a little bit to culture, right? Selecting the right one. But at the end of the day, there is no perfect one. Just realizing that taking a look at these and looking at what controls map or align best with the objectives of my organization, of my school. So I would hope that through your normal process that your school is going through normal annual strategic planning. Our business does it. Most of our clients do. In fact, many of the audits and security assessments that we do, we're assessing the framework as well. That includes the management framework, includes having those annual strategic planning sessions where you identify goals that are security related, IT related, and business related, and those get put out there, and directives are sent forward for the different groups or verticals within higher ed. So move to select one that works. But how do you do that with the different verticals? And I have personally worked with a lot of higher eds, whether it's PCI auditing or performing governance work. I implemented for several organizations a governance program, IT governance program, and it was eye-opening. And I've done this for my whole career. And I found that in the higher education industry, unfortunately, there's verticals. It tends to be a little bit siloed, if you will. And the way to break down some of that is an enterprise approach, right? That is enterprise wide, including the business units, all of them as part of the process, whether, and starting with rather at the tone at the top, that is with, having that framework and the governance body to oversee it. So whether you establish a risk committee or you're, as part of the structure that you already have in place under the provost or whatever your organization has specifically. But establishing that buy-in from the stakeholders is fundamental and critical to the success of not only the selection of the appropriate framework, but once you've got it, to implement it. And as you start going through the implementation, and what does implement mean, by the way? So let's say I pick this NIST cybersecurity framework. I look at it, and the reason why I pick it is because I was part of your annual strategic planning. I sat at the table. I understood what the directives were from my group that impacted my vertical within the college or university. I take those marching orders back to my group, my team. We start laying out, aligning those control objectives within that framework to what applies to my area of business in that college or that university. And certain controls are going to fall off That is to say, they won't apply necessarily to me or to the school even overall. So it's okay to have some of these be non-applicable. Some of them you may feel like, hey, I want to complement some of them with the subsequent controls that may not be called out as part of, in your eyes, as part of the control objective. And you can do that. You can modify these frameworks, but start with one that's, I don't recommend you building your own, but start with one that's out there and select it, by using a committee or group that's part of the college or university that you're at. Align it with the objectives that came from the top down, and move to do that. And the implementation piece is a big part in terms of, so I have it now, understanding parts of it. A big piece of the implementation will be mapping controls from your policy set. And CJ and I are going to talk a little bit about that throughout this presentation because it's fundamental. The key where, where we keep saying controls, well, these controls, they live within your policy set. So mapping those controls to the control objectives in your framework is going to serve you well down the road when you're testing those controls, when you're doing it through a self-assessment or an independent third parties coming in to assess you or audit you to those controls to make sure they're operating effectively. So that's a key part about it. And that's kind of where you kind of get started with all of this, is the selection, moving to implement, so education, and having that body to report to as you start to go through and utilize that framework.
Yeah. So I like to focus here on how do you get started, right? And it's a great question, and one that a lot of you maybe are asking. As I look at the titles, I don't see a lot of security in people's titles. A lot of IT knowledge. It has certainly has an overlap with security. So you may not be familiar with these frameworks. So how do you get started? Well, you have to open it up. You have to read them. You have to look at them. Right? You have to, and I think when you start to read what those controls are that Jerry's alluding to, you'll see that some of them make sense. Some of them are in English for you, or in the language that you speak. Some of them are not going to be. And I tell you a story. One of my first introductions at Compass, I started off. They brought me in as an auditor. I knew the NIST that you're seeing here. The NIST, if you see the .gov, right? This was my Bible for a very long time, so I know the NIST inside and out. And one of the first audits I did, I'm not sure if I can say this school, but they're great, so I can say positive things. But Albany Law School, obviously up in Albany, and we did a risk assessment for them. Went through the entire process and met with their staff. Their staff was great. Hand them a final deliverable with risks and findings and recommendations, right? All things that you kind of get to say, hey, we have this, we don't have this, we have this, we don't have this. So I remember presenting it to them and handing it to them, and they basically said, what do I do with this? I don't have the staff to do this. I don't even know what half of it means and half of it says. And I took a step back and I said, wow, that makes sense. I get it, right? How do you go implement these things and align to these things if you don't really know what they're asking for? And that was actually what got us to create what is the virtual CISO practice that I run today, is because companies needed help, right? Reading these and understanding what they had to do, giving them the direction and helping them actually implement these controls. So when you look at this, right, open up the assessment. You're going to see the next slide, and I'll just go to it now to make it easy. Once I can get my cursor on it, you're going to see that to go through a self-assessment or to really get yourself started. Open it up, start reading it, see what makes sense to you and see what doesn't make sense to you, right? A lot of this is going to be something that you will see that you understand, and you can say we have it or we don't have it. And the biggest key when you're going through any kind of assessment, especially on the self-assessment side, is it's no wrong answers. If you're not doing something, say you're not doing something. It's okay, right? It's not anybody's fault. Maybe we just didn't know. Maybe we didn't have the budget for it. So I really take the approach of there's no wrong answers here. We want to call out risk. And just because we call it a risk doesn't mean it's a bad thing. It's actually a good thing, right? When we think about risk, right, we just don't want to ignore it, right? We can accept risk. We can say, hey, that's too expensive for us to fix or to implement, right? We can transfer that risk. We can get, hey, we have our cyber liability insurance, right? We can transfer that risk onto somebody else. We just can't ignore the risk, right? And just by calling it out, you're not ignoring the risk, and we can put a plan together, and move forward. So again, when going back to the previous slide, how do I get started? open it up. I highly recommend the self-assessment that you see here, the link that you see here. It was actually created by Brian Kelly, who was supposed to be here today, but he ends up at another speaking engagement in Kentucky today. But he was the former CISO at Educause before he came over and joined our staff. And he created both the assessment tools that you're looking at here, that self-assessment tool, which really is great and gives a lot of direction and a lot of explanation, as well as the third-party risk assessment one where you're still answering the same kind of questions, but it's something that you can provide to your vendors, to your clients, to people who are a donator, people who want to partner with your organization. From there. But these are great tools to look at and tie really, really, really well, in my opinion, to that assessment that Jerry was talking about previously on the previous slide.
Thanks, CJ. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, with the self-assessment, so we're saying, we're mentioning that a number of times, and really, what are you doing in terms of when you are assessing? You're testing your controls, right? So if I have a control, let's just take a simple one about physical access to a facility where maybe their student records are located. We have a lock on the door. That's a control. I have a lock. Maybe I have a camera. So the lock, the camera, maybe I have a secretary or somebody out front. So, or even a security guard. So the aggregate of these controls, mitigates the risk of somebody entering the facility or the room where the student grades are, in my example, providing them, compromising it so that unauthorized access is gained to student records, which is in violation of the school's policies, clearly. So the controls are in the policies. The testing of the control is how you assess, you measure and test the controls that you define. So within your policy, you'd say you have a clearly defined role, who's doing this, and then what their responsibility is. So the control in the case of a camera, be like, all right, we'll have cameras at all critical, locations that contain any kind of student records or any PII or any kind of, information that is confidential. That's how you kind of lay it out as a control. So you clearly define what it is so we can measure it as auditors or a person assessing it. Or if you're self-assessing, you're going to test that control by saying, hey, our policy says this. Is it there? Let me go check. The camera's broken. And well, the control doesn't exist. It's broken. Control doesn't exist. Another good point about assessing, I should mention as I touch on my broken camera example, is you kind of have to assess, and it's not a one and done, as CJ said earlier. Controls break, and like the example of my camera, that's a simplistic example, but many controls that are more sophisticated, even they can break. They can break for a lot of reasons. They can break if they're not well defined, and it's part of a process. You remember the people, process, technology. Well, within the process, the procedures that are being carried out. If I've got a new employee in that role, and if I haven't done a good job in clearly educating and documenting in my policies the controls and the control objectives, maybe I even haven't mapped them to my framework that I've selected. And also when I go through, if I don't continuously look to improve and assess, self-assess, a new employee in that same role may read a procedure differently, may carry out that procedure slightly differently, and may introduce risk, whereas the previous employee that did it, the faculty member, whatever, the staff, whatever, they may have done it properly and it was great. We had no risk. We tested it and it was bulletproof, but all of a sudden, boom, and that changed. The other thing is you may have, even if you're quite static, which I'm sure everybody's changing, you may have a system that's, Blackboard or some of these other systems that are phenomenal. And most of the higher eds, a lot of the higher eds use Blackboard and some others. But even if it's an enhancement that comes out or a patch, or, there's changes happening, whether you change them or not, in those introduce risks potentially. And like I mentioned, the idea of the threat landscape constantly testing all of us, right? And so assess and reassess all the time. That's a key part of that. The second bullet I want to touch on, a little bit, and then I want to open it to CJ and see if Jeff has any questions that may have popped up. But the vendor piece, right? All of us use third-party vendors. It's a great way to level the playing field for if you're a smaller college competing with a higher education university that's huge. You can compete better by having tools that can compensate some of the, maybe because they're shorter staff, you can kind of level it a little bit with that. So great tools, great opportunities for smaller organizations and even large ones to deliver, better quality to, in this case, students and faculty and whomever, the professors, whoever is serving. But these vendors that we're using, whether they're hosting providers or software providers, we need to make sure that we evaluate them constantly to ensure that they have not only our best interest, but that of our students and the folks that we serve. So that's a key point. So third-party vendor management, I do want to hand it over to CJ because he does this integrally all the time at what he does. He's chomping at the bit. I see him moving a lot over there. Go ahead, CJ.
Yes. So keep this in mind, right? We work with a lot of third parties, and never, ever, ever in my life will I discourage you or anybody from working with a third party, right? Working with a third party is going to make you more efficient. It's going to expand your capabilities. Make again, you think about efficiency and proficiency. That's what these vendors do for you. Where we really want to pay attention to the vendors that we're using or the third parties we're using is what's their criticality, right? So the way I judge a vendor and the way the industry judges a vendor is you have critical, high risk, critical, high, medium, low risk vendor, right? And just because they're a high risk or critical risk vendor doesn't mean we don't work with them, right? That doesn't mean they don't have a security posture, they don't have a security program, but they're critical for a couple of reasons. They may be critical to our service delivery, right? If they go out of business, we can't execute, right? We lose X, Y, or Z, right? We can't deliver on what we're promising that we're going to deliver on because our vendor went belly up, so to speak, right? So that makes a vendor critical. They have access. What are the crown jewels at your organization, right? At your institution, right? PII, right? Maybe there's if there's any kind of tuition assistance and there's any kind of financial data that the families have, right? Where are we storing those things? Do our vendors have access to those things? Do our third parties have access to those things? And if they get compromised, does that then compromise your school's data, right? If that's the case, that's a critical vendor. We need to make sure that they have the same controls in place that the industry recommends to make sure that they're protecting our data the way that we would. If something happens to them, it's still your reputation on the line. So these vendors and these third parties are an extension of your organization, and treat them as such, right? They're great partners, but there's a trust but verify, right? We can trust that they're a good partner for us, but we have to verify that they're doing what they say they're supposed to be doing to safeguard our information and protect our reputation, protect our organization, right? It's not just about that one person. It's about the entire organization. And there's a lot of things, a lot of people that make up your organization.
Yeah, one other note too on that third party, vendor management aspect of it. It's not an option for those of you that are accept payment card information as a form of tuition or any kind of form of payment on campus. So as a qualified security assessor company, which is Compass, I am a QSA myself. And with respect to that, it's required that you go through and have your vendor management, that you are partnering with and working with only providers that are PCI compliant, meaning they've gone through their annual audit. And like CJ said earlier, and we'll say it again, this isn't a one and done, it's a repeat process. The whole third party management, I've no sooner assessed a vendor and then it comes around again next year and I'm going to assess them again because controls change. We mentioned that before, whether it's the system or the environment or the threats, they're changing. So you're constantly, certainly for PCI, required to, and in with these frameworks and such, it also, it requires and it prompts you to evaluate and reassess them on an annual basis.
So people processing technology, right? We touched on this a little bit in the balancing act. So when we look at people first, right? Kind of for a different reason than maybe what you're thinking, right? When we say people first, I say people first here because obviously we need people to be able to execute, right? But at the same time, I'm going to talk about education and awareness and how we're allowing our people to help protect our organization. Like it or not, like the saying or not, people are the weakest link, right? And it's cringeworthy, right? Because we try to educate, but the difference is we have a heart, right? We have a brain, and we can be fooled, right? We can be trusting. And when we're looking at the bad actors that are out there, the use of AI and the sophistication, right? I look at the people that can be that initial access to our organization, right? And they can be fooled. All of a sudden, the bad actors in. At the same time, the people can also help protect our organization because they're going to be the ones that help fulfill that culture, right? They're going to help push that culture. They're going to embrace that culture. They're going to communicate that culture. They're going to be leaders by example right? They're not going to think, oh, I got to do security awareness training again, or I can't do this. This is a problem for me to have a password and to have a phone to be able to log in, right? So people, have to help protect the organization, right? Our people have to be that they're that first line of defense, right? You're the first ones to see a problem. You're the first one generally to be able to identify a problem. The first person to be able to communicate that problem so that the people in place can react to it, right? So people first, right? We need people to be able to execute, right? Whether it's a technology or the processes, or the policies that we have. We also need people to be vigilant and help protect the organization. And again, go back to trust but verify, right? If it's too good to be true, right, it might be too good to be true, right? So part of that awareness and that educating, right, it starts with our people. Starts with our people. Policies, right? Policies, and then the home of controls, right? So to me, this is the chicken and the egg. So knowing the sophistication of your institutions, I'll bet most of you have policies. If not, that's something you probably have to get onto. You have to get onto. But can you just design policies out of thin air? Could one of your staff just go ahead and say, all right, I'm going to start writing policies, right? What policies should I have, right? The answer is probably no, right? The answer is probably no. So when I say the chicken and the egg, the controls to me come first, right? Go familiarize yourself with the frameworks that we've shown you, and you'll have the links to. Familiarize yourself with those frameworks that all have the controls that we've talked about. And now you're going to tie those controls that they're saying that you should have back to policy, right? It's kind of I don't want to call it a cheat sheet, but you can understand exactly what the guidelines are and the recommendations are, and you can work that back until you develop policy. One of the hard things about policy is I work with a lot of companies that when we start with them, I say, do you have policies? And they say, yep, we got policies. And where'd you get your policies? Oh, I downloaded them off the internet, right? They belong to some other company. I just kind of transformed them into my own, right? That's a problem, right? When we have policy, we need to be able to comply with our own policies. So you may look at a set of controls and a set of policies and say, yep, we're doing this, we're not doing this, right? Do we need to? Maybe not, honestly, right? Again, there's no out of a box, right, cookie cutter security framework or security program for your company. It's going to be what works for your company. And maybe we don't have these, so we're going to put these over to the side for now, but these are gaps we're going to work on, right? And try to implement and put a timeline on when we're going to implement those. So I really recommend that you go as we where do we start, right? Start with those controls, start with those frameworks, and work yourself back. And one of those things that you have to have and you're going to be required to have is policy. And if you have policy, right, look yourself in the mirror and say, where did I get those policies, right? Were they from Google? Were they from another .edu? Were they from another institution? Do they fit my program, right? Part of going through an assessment, you'll be able to understand that our policies do align up with what we do as an organization. So again, very important there.
Yeah, can I jump in, CJ? One note too on
Absolutely.
policies, because honestly, if you take a step back too, a little bit more, I love what you said about the controls. You're really starting with the controls to protect, to build them into the policies, but understanding where your PII is, right? So, and even if your college or university is developing, some unique software or some new innovation, that's your secret sauce. Also, that's restricted type data. So understand first where everything is. You can assess and evaluate and identify where my PII is in my organization. And then from that, like CJ said, hey, let's build those controls to protect that, and go through. And one other note or last note relative to policies, there's, excuse me, there's five, I call it the anatomy of a policy, but there's five key pieces typically. So it's okay to download a policy set from the internet and try to work with it, but don't just try to plug it in as it is. It's low hanging fruit for an auditor. We just eat that up. But it also, worse than that, it doesn't serve you well at all. You're going to have control weaknesses everywhere. You need to identify. So let's take the five pieces. Identify first, what's the objective of this policy? The objective of this access control policy is to govern access at my university or my college, blah, 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 to restrict it, to, whatever. And then, so you've got a clearly defined objective. The second aspect of it, what's the scope of it? Is it scope to one of the colleges within my university or one of the verticals within my college, or is it enterprise wide, including third party providers that I may utilize or vendors I may utilize, contractors, whatever. So make sure your scope is clearly defined. And I'll skip over the most important part, which is I'll come back to. But the next piece of it is that you should have a sort of it definitely has to have an authorization, right? I go in and I've audited, and organizations may have a great policy, have all the pieces I'm talking about, but it wasn't approved or reviewed by the board or the cabinet, depending on what your hierarchy is at your college or university. So make sure that's got the appropriate authorization and it's reviewed at least annually. So they're looking at any changes, they're approving them. Now they're viable and implementing them by making them available to the folks that need to follow those. Moving through to the fourth point, which is enforcement. I can have great policies that say, "Thou shalt do this, thou shalt do that, don't do this," and it's wonderful. But at the end of the day, what happens? What are the ramifications if my staff or a member of my team is not adhering to these policies? So you need to have some enforcement statement. Typically, you always have read, I'm sure we all have seen the ones where up to and including termination, blah blah blah, and it's great. Have some kind of at least bite in these policies. And the fifth part, which is the most important, that's why I skipped over it first, just so I can finish with it. And those are the control statements within the policy. The controls, the things we've been talking about, the clearly defined role and responsibility. You can't just say, for example, you may think a control is, hey, I'm going to perform vulnerability scans regularly. First of all, who's I'm, and then what is regularly? So okay, I'll make it better. We're going to perform vulnerability scans every quarter. That's phenomenal. I know what's going to happen. However, I don't know what it's on. I don't know who's doing it. An appropriate control statement, a complete one, would be maybe the IT director of IT or the whatever IT staff, a clearly role that exists on your org chart. This person will perform a quarterly, so now I know the frequency, vulnerability scan on all internal and external IP addresses. Now that's a control statement. So the list of those makes up that particular policy. Those are the ones we talked about earlier, mapping to this framework. So now you've got them tied into the framework that you've selected.
Yeah, and again, for me, the last piece on those policies, and then we'll move on to the tools, is does your organization know they exist? Right? How do we communicate those policies to the rest of the organization? Right? If we spend all this time building policy and standing behind policy and explaining to anybody who asks that we have policy, right? Are they any good if nobody knows where they exist or what they are? Right? The answer is no. Right? So we want to make sure that those are in a public location and that people know they exist, and you really want them reading and acknowledging them on an annual basis. Now, not every single policy in there is going to be something that's pertinent to each part of the organization, right? So understanding which each part, what part of the policy does each part of the organization need to identify and acknowledge, right? So we know they exist. We can't just create policy and then tuck it away and say we'll update this as needed, but we've got policy, right? That's not the point of policy. So make sure you have a communication plan with those policies and make sure that they're getting acknowledged. Lastly, again, the tools you own. What we see far too often is people get enamored by tools and they want to keep adding more and more tools when a lot of what they already own probably has more capability than what they're using it for. I use Microsoft as an example. You've got the Microsoft suite. There are native Microsoft tools from a security perspective that you can turn on that you just may not know about, right? So evaluate the tools that you have and understand what their capabilities are, right? Are you getting the most bang out of your buck for those tools that you own? And inventory them, right? Those should be inventoried. You should be able to go through them. You should know how long do you have them for, how much you're paying for them. Are we still utilizing them? Are we getting the most bang for our buck out of that tool? And is there anything we can consolidate? Right? We all get a budget, and it's never enough, right? So if you can free some of that budget to put it towards things that you really need, then great. I'll tell you, I'll go back to my Coast Guard days again, and I used to get a budget every single year. And the way the Coast Guard and the military works, which I'm against, and I'll be very open about it, is if I didn't use my whole budget, I lost it. I didn't get that budget for next year. And it drove me nuts because I thought I'm being fiscally responsible. You should reward me and let me keep my budget for next year because things may change and you know that I'll only buy things that I need, right? Private sector is a little bit different, right? K through 12 and private schools, that you guys are in, hopefully is a little bit different, right? We want to try to save money. We want to try to consolidate tools, but we also want to be very secure and make sure we're maximizing those tools. So, Aurelia, I implore you to inventory those tools, understand their capabilities, right? If you don't know the full capabilities, right, get training, do some research, again, most bang for your buck with those tools.
Yeah, one last note on tools too, though, is also you go back to policies as well. Is one of the policies is information or data classification. So classifying these systems that maybe you've got your student records going through one of these tools or systems, whether it's a platform local to your college or university, or if it's in the cloud. Regardless, at the end of the day, you need to go through, know where your data is, assessing it, know where it is, and then put controls in place to protect that data. Those controls are in your policies, and then go through and assess, make sure those controls continuously are still working. But that's kind of the evolution of the thought process as you move forward through this.
So back to that security culture, right? And awareness. Awareness is at all levels of the institution, not just at the top, not just maybe at the bottom of the student level, right? Every single part of the organization is a way for a bad actor or somebody to get in, or for harm to happen, right? So we want to educate and make the entire organization aware, right? That's having a security and awareness program, fully, very comprehensive. Whether it's onboarding new employees, we want to make sure they go through our training so they understand what our policies, our procedures are, and we know that you're educated, right? We do that again annually, or even more often than that. Phishing, right? Phishing, social engineering, it's still the number one way that these bad actors are getting us. If you're not doing phishing tests through email yet, you should start doing phishing tests. And for nothing else, what it's going to do is, we're not here to trick you, but we're here to educate you. We're here to make you aware. And if I know that my organization might test me, then I'm going to have to get an email that says, hey, you failed a test. I hate failing tests, right? So if I'm afraid I might fail a test, I'm going to be that much more vigilant, that much more on top of it, right? Because I don't want to go up to my boss and say, sorry, I clicked, and who knows what that could have meant to my organization. The other side is, so I attended a seminar, and it was by his name was Chris Hagnady. He's written at the time, he'd written 8 books on social engineering, and by all accounts was an expert in social engineering. And attending his, and again, for me, you feel like people call me an expert or a professional. Like, you shouldn't make mistakes. Well, we all make mistakes. And he told a story that it was just a perfect storm. He just sent Amazon an email. He ended up receiving an email from Amazon. He clicked on it, and it ended up being a social engineering test. His system was hacked. His system was encrypted, and it was, first off, embarrassing for him, but ended up costing him money at the same time. Right. So what that told me is, listen, if somebody who's written 8 books and is by all accounts an expert in social engineering, and he can get fooled, then I sure as heck can get fooled. Right. And if that's going to happen to him, you can get fooled. So part of that security, part of that awareness is continuously test and assess and make sure that our workforce is up to par, up to speed on where we want them to be.
One note on, if I could jump in on the education side of it too, is like we talked about maybe, when we were on the people, process, technology slide, with people being, a lot of times it can be the weakest link. We often preach that it also can be your strongest advocate, right? It can be your strongest point when you educate your staff regularly and properly. And these folks can be, whether it's physical security, where someone's entering the facility and maybe walks into an area that, in social engineering, you see it all the time. They walk in with authority, and people just, oh, he or she must belong here. She's walking in like she owns a place, and it's kind of kind of educate people on, hey, listen, it's okay to stop and ask, because as the next slide says, it's everybody's responsibility. So I may be a clerk or something at the college or university that you work at, and if someone's walking through, I don't care if they have a suit and tie. If they're walking through, I still can say, hey, how can I help you? You don't need to tackle them to the ground and pin them down. But it's okay to say, how can I help you, and who are you here to see, and that kind of thing. And so we always believe strongly in terms of educating our staff, how they can help throughout these efforts, and also into escorting folks to locations that we know have been classified as confidential because there may be student records in certain areas, or in the payment card industry, as I mentioned, being a QSA, there's areas of your facility that need more controls because payment card information either stored, transmitted, or processed through that area. You need a level of controls and awareness around that environment.
Yeah, I agree. Thanks, Jerry. That was perfect. Go back to say no, not no, right? This is a little bit repetitive, but again, a little bit of a different angle. right? When people come to us with problems, problem after problem after problem, right? And there's never a solution, right? It's always, can you come with a solution as well? We deal with the same thing from a security perspective, right? We don't want to say no, right? We want to say yes. We want you to be able to do what you need to do to be able to either do your job or to continue learning and being educated, right? So how do we say yes, right? But in the most secure way. And it goes back to the term we've been using all afternoon, which is assess. We're constantly assessing, right? So you bring us an idea, you bring your staff an idea, you bring IT an idea, and they say, let me take a look at it, right? They're going to assess to say, hey, what level of security do we have with being able to say yes? How can this potentially hurt us, right? Are we risking the compromise of anything, right? We're giving more access to somebody who doesn't need access, right? So we want to assess that so we can say yes, or we can say it's not a total no, right? We can do it partial, but here's why we can't, right? Because here's the security ramifications if we went full yes on this. So give us a chance, right? Give the organization a chance to say yes. Um, let's understand how we can do things as securely as humanly possible. Our goal is to protect the organization, right? You guys do great things. And if we have a compromise or we do something that lets down our guard, right, and it limits your ability to do those great things, right, and serve those students, right, that's a bad thing. We don't want that. So we want to say yes, but we want to make sure you can continue to operate. So the education versus training, right? You guys, out of anybody we talk to, understand the education side of things, right? Which it's knowledge, gaining knowledge, understanding what we're talking about, right? It's having that education around whatever that topic is. The training is different, right? And again, I'm going to go lean on military again. I did training every year for 22 years, repetitive, right? And sometimes it was the same thing. It's like, oh, we got to do this again, right? But what we're building is we're building that skill, right? If I don't do something for 6 months, I'm not skilled at it, right? I'm not going to remember how to do it. I'm going to have to go learn it all over again. And when something comes up, I may not be able to react as quickly or mitigate that problem as quickly or solve that problem as quickly. So when we talk about training and we do things over and over and over, it's building that muscle memory. So when something happens, we know how to react, right? When I give these presentations and I give trainings to different companies, one of the things that slides I put up is if something happens right now, would you know who to call, email, contact? Do you have the email address? Do you have the phone number? How quickly could you respond? And it's kind of scary, but almost every single time, about 90% of people say, I have absolutely no idea how to contact somebody, who I'm supposed to contact, especially now that some of them are in a more remote, work environment. They have no idea what to do, right? So from a training perspective, have we trained our employees to know what to do when something happens? Time is of the essence. Do you know who to contact, and do they know what to do and how to escalate and where these things eventually get to? So that's the education part versus the training part, right? We want you to have the skill to understand what to do in certain situations. And security is not just an IT problem, right? A lot of people look at it as being an IT problem, and hopefully all the IT managers I'm seeing on here, can agree. But it's everybody's responsibility. It's from the top of the organization to embrace it, to embrace that culture, to communicate that culture, to get the buy-in, all the way down to the newest employee at the company.
So last slide or so here, just kind of bringing it home with evolving threats. CJ and I mentioned earlier the different aspects of, from the implementation of the frameworks to the people, process, technology. And even if your college or university is stagnant, the threats are ever changing, right? They're constantly coming at us personally and professionally. So a lot of things we talk about here, you should think about in your own life about being diligent, whether it's, not clicking on links in emails without knowing the party that sent it for sure, things like that. Be diligent. So when you look at that and how to stay ahead of it, education comes back to education as being the key. Neighborhood watch in cyberspace is Brian's term, which I love that he had that out there for part of his slide. But great organizations like ASNI staying together and collaborating with folks like at a forum like this is the way we improve our knowledge and our education. Even if you come away with with one nugget or two that you didn't know before, didn't think of before. And that's why, CJ and I were encouraging guys, ask us questions along the way. And sometimes folks are nervous to do that, but if you don't, in the next slide, we'll have how you can reach out to us, and we'd love to definitely field more technical questions if they're there, or business questions, whatever they may be. But joining organizations like this is a great start. Others like EDUCAUSE and other ones, CISA, the CISA site, CISA has a lot of great content that I encourage you to take a look at. It's a great wealth of information. We have a web page ourselves where we have a sort of an aggregate of RSA feeds that go in from different threat organizations and channels that we belong to, that kind of report certain things. Not all of these apply to each and every client of ours, but some do. Some may be as simplistic as a security patch that came out for a particular platform or operating system, or rather application, things like that. And others are specific threats, to sites or things like that. But staying educated on them, knowing what you're up against, and if certain ones apply to your school, you should look into that and risk assess them. Again, a great recommendation. But for those of you that are PCI or need to be PCI compliant, it's not just a recommendation or best practice; it's a requirement. So risk rank those threats that are out there. Do they apply to my college or university? How do they? What's the risk level? How can I mitigate that risk by implementing controls, and then moving through to self-assess or independently assess those, and to test those controls. So it looks like we got about 2 minutes left here. I purposely kind of sped that
Right,
one up so to
right,
see.
right on time, right?
Yeah, I want to see if you had any additional questions, or CJ, if you had any more comments, or Jeff, if any questions came in.